Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Katie Zontak, and I'm the Cultural Arts Director at the JCC in Buffalo, New York. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's event, which is included in the People of the Book Author Series, one of the many programs presented through the JCC. The Cultural Arts Department at the JCC in Buffalo supports 2 art galleries, presents an annual book and arts fair, a film festival, and offers concerts, family programs, adult discussion groups, and workshops throughout the year that showcase Jewish culture. The People of the Book Author Series has presented both in-person and virtual events over the past month and continues tonight by welcoming back to Buffalo, virtually, author Eyal Press, speaking on his most recent book, Dirty Work. The event is generously sponsored by the Tanya Ganson Book Fair Endowment Fund. Eyal Press is a writer and journalist who contributes to The New Yorker, The New York Times, and other publications. Since the spring of 2021, he is also a sociologist with a Ph.D. from New York University. He grew up in Buffalo. He is and served as the backdrop of his first book, Absolute Convictions, in 2006. His second book, Beautiful Souls, 2012, examined the nature of moral courage through the stories of individuals who risk their careers and sometimes their lives to defy unjust orders. A New York Times editor's choice, the book has been translated into numerous languages and selected as the common read at several universities, including and his alma mater, Brown University. His most recent work, Dirty Work, 2021, examines the morally troubling jobs that society tacitly condones and the hidden class of workers who do them. It was recently named one of the 10 best books of 2021 by Publishers Weekly and has also been named the New York Times Editor's Choice. A recipient of the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism, Press has received an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Cullman Center Fellowship at the New York Public Library, and a Puffin Foundation Fellowship at Type Media Center. And joining Eyal in conversation tonight is Mateo Taussig-Rubbo, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Buffalo Law School. Interweaving his concerns as a legal scholar with his training in cultural anthropology, he has focused on a set of legal and theoretical challenges posed by changes in the nature of state sovereignty in an era of privatization and globalization. In 2 geographical areas, he considers these changes to be examining both institutional forms, law and policy, and moral, ethical, and social values. So I want to welcome you both. This certainly promises to be an engaging evening, and I'm sure the discussion will spark many ongoing questions and conversations far beyond tonight's event. Before I turn the program over to you, I just am going to ask that I'm going to be turning everybody's camera off and keeping everybody on mute for tonight. We will be doing a Q&A, so you can certainly feel free to send your questions through the chat, and we'll, Mateo and Eyal will do their best to get to all the questions that are asked. So thank you both again, and we'll get started.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Just working out my setup here. Welcome to Buffalo, Eyal. It's great to see you, and it's nice to have this community gathered, albeit remotely. You know, as was just mentioned, you have a very deep connection to Buffalo. It's the site of your first, I think it's your first book. It was the first book of yours I read when I moved to Buffalo, and it really provided a powerful orientation to parts of the city's history. And I'm wondering if you might just sketch out for us a little bit the trajectory that brings you from that first book, focusing, if I can say, if I remember correctly, on your father, a very, should we say, principled man, and then your next book about also very principled people, and then to where this text is taking us. What's been your evolution to over the arc of these books, starting off in Buffalo and bringing you back here today?
Well, thank you, Mateo. Thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone for tuning in. It's very exciting and meaningful for me to talk to an audience of folks from Buffalo because that's my home. I'm a native son. I don't live there now, but Buffalo is always near and dear to me. And as Mateo was saying, it is the subject of my first book, Absolute Convictions, which is the story of the abortion conflict, the abortion wars, really, which divided and polarized the city and culminated in an act of terrible violence, the murder of Dr. Barnett Slepian. You know, as I've said before many times, I won't go on too long about Absolute Convictions, but it was really that event that pulled me towards the subject of wanting to write about how this had happened in my hometown and how it had engulfed not just the city, but my father's medical practice. And as you say, that book, and certainly Beautiful Souls, my second book, was sort of principally focused, I would say, on people who, in very challenging situations, do the right thing, or do at least what they believe is the right thing. Of course, to do the right thing in the abortion conflict for one person means you're doing exactly the wrong thing. But what interested me and what I wrote about in both of those books was moral courage and what it takes and what sorts of factors enable some people to stand by what they think is right when there's a great deal of risk involved. And after two books dealing with that, I think I really craved wanting to explore moral questions about individual action, but also about society, to kind of pull back the lens away from individuals and to look more at the social forces that constrain and impinge on the choices people make. And I knew I wanted to write about that, to kind of write in a more structural way. Maybe it was getting a Ph.D. in sociology while I was writing the book. And then secondly, I think I also wanted to write about kind of the gray actors who go along in situations where they feel they're being pulled to do something wrong, but they do it anyway. And this is not a book, Dirty Work, that is about people who gleefully do wrong, who, you know, what we would call, I suppose, willing executioners. It is about people who are caught up in situations that lead them to do things that create incredible internal conflict and emotional, and to take an emotional and moral toll. And it struck me as I was thinking about the conversation around inequality, that we don't account for that very much. It's sort of separate from the conversation about inequality, that inequality is a conversation generally about income, about wealth, about resources. But I had a desire to think about inequality through the prism of moral questions. Who is it that gets to sleep well at night? Who ends up feeling burdened and, in a sense, dirtied? And that's when I came across this idea of dirty work. And maybe I should unpack the concept a little bit, because I think when people, for those here who haven't read the book or heard me talk about it, you might think I'm talking about collecting garbage on the street at night, or the colloquial meaning of dirty work, which is just any sort of unpleasant job. And I think people think of a physically dirtying job. But in my book, dirty work refers to something different. It's morally troubling activity, and crucially, morally troubling activity that society depends on and tacitly condones, but generally doesn't want to hear too much about. And I drew that definition and that concept from a sociologist, where actually the book begins with the story of this man named Everett Hughes, who wrote an essay back in the early 1960s called Good People and Dirty Work. And in that essay, Hughes drew on a semester he spent in post-war Germany, right after World War II. And I don't think people are gonna have too much doubt about what dirty work, when I say that, what dirty work refers to in his title. He goes to Germany and he wants to, and he reconnects with people he knew before the war. And he wants to know how they managed to stay in Germany as the Nazis seized power, as they committed these horrendous crimes, the Holocaust and this totalitarian regime. And he wants to know how they think of themselves in relationship to this work. And the people Hughes knew were, like him, cosmopolitan intellectuals and professionals and people who, in letters to him, had, renounced Nazism and said, we have nothing to do with that. And that is part of what Hughes heard when he went there. And he heard these people say, we're ashamed whenever anyone brings this up. But then in the same conversations, he would hear people say, well, but the Jews, they were a problem. And something had to be done about this problem. He hears this particular phrase at a tea with an architect he meets one night. And the architect basically, defines the Jewish problem in such a way that, in Hughes's eyes, makes him complicit in what happened, because it's not that the architect is saying he approves of what the Nazis did, because he doesn't. He says he's ashamed of it. But from the other side, he also says, this was a problem that someone had to take care of. I didn't want to be involved in it myself, he's saying between the lines, but someone has to deal with it. The Jews were taking all the good jobs, they were gathered in these ghettos. And out of these conversations, Hughes writes this essay, Good People and Dirty Work. And the fundamental point he's making is that these two things are related, that as much as we like to think of dirty work as something that the rogue actors in society do, the reality is that dirty work proceeds with a kind of what he called an unconscious mandate from the good people in society who don't want to hear about it, but who want someone to settle the problem for them. And what was so striking to me about this essay is what Hughes says towards the end of it, which is that this concept, far from being unique to Nazi Germany, is actually a universal one, that in his eyes, dirty work exists in every society, and this dynamic between the good people and the dirty work is replicated. And so I took that as a point of departure to ask, what kind of dirty work happens in this society? What kind of mandate does it have from the good people? And what does that tell us about both the way we organize morally troubling activities and the nature of inequality? And that's kind of the text, the main thrust of what I tried to write about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So in this really beautifully written book, the reader is treated to a feast of a tour of America, going behind all these closed doors that most of us never get to go behind. We're taken to prisons with the medical staff. We're taken to the slaughterhouse with the illegal undocumented worker. We're taken to the drone operator in the war on terror. And you managed to stitch together through this thread of dirty work, all these different spaces, all these different kinds of people. And so maybe if you could just sort of talk a little bit about how you came to identify each of these different sites, or you could focus on one. So I like the idea that you're reading this essay about Nazi Germany and you think, okay, where's the dirty work? But how did you actually go about finding it, and why did you find it where you did?
Great question, and multiple questions in it. Thank you. So one place I started was actually with a clue that Everett Hughes drops in that same essay. And keep in mind, I think the speech he gave was right after he came back from Germany. So he originally says all of this in the 1940s, but he updates it to the 1960s. And when he talks about the United States and dirty work here, he talks about prisoners. And he actually says, from time to time, we read in the papers of these, brutal events that take place behind the walls of prisons. And, when people read about this in the paper, they there's a tendency to sort of, ask, well, who were the awful guards who did this? You know, who were these brutal guys who roughed up this person who you know was maybe handcuffed or couldn't defend themselves? But you know, to him, it's a perfect example of a replication of this dynamic. You know, as he says, prisoners are an outgroup, right? They are seen through a sort of lens of not quite like the good people in society, not quite like the rest of us, not quite entitled to the same rights and to the same treatment. And he then proceeds to say, well, you know, what does that guard really think? Let's imagine this from the perspective of that guard. You know, he's as liable to think, you know, society actually wants me to be a bit brutal with these people, as he is to think I should respect their rights. And, you know, here we are 50 years, 60 years later, the United States has the largest prison system in the world, And that alone interested me to sort of think about dirty work as sort of thinking about the prison system as a site of work. You know, who works there and what kinds of moral conflicts arise. And it particularly interested me to think about the fact that the jails and prisons in the United States perform this social function of taking care of a problem. And the problem is where to put all of the mentally ill people who don't have access to care in hospitals and in their communities. And so I tell that story in the book about how there was a movement to deinstitutionalize, to provide more humane treatment. It goes back to the Kennedy era, but the money was never there to provide these services. And what really ended up happening was that jails and prisons ended up, in a sense, doing the dirty work or taking care of the problem, and notably taking care of it behind closed doors, right? So the rest of society, the good people, if you will, don't have to see it. They don't have to think about it. And so that's where the book begins. It begins with a mental health aide at a prison who is watching abuses unfold and feels thrust into a moral dilemma that is extremely intense and extremely taxing for her, but that she slowly comes to realize is actually a societal problem, right? Like she first, and I think this is true of all the characters in the book, they first think of this as their fault, as, you know, they're doing something awful. They're involved in something wrong. They're dirtying their hands. And then slowly they start to ask themselves questions and wonder about, well, wait a minute, what is society really asking of me in this situation? So that one was one. I can talk a little bit about some of the other sort of, because the case studies were chosen pretty carefully to try to illuminate different things. But that's kind of where the book starts and why it started with prisons.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great. So, I mean, there's one theme going on, just to pick up on this, the process that your people, the people you speak with, that they go through, sort of blaming themselves or identifying the problem themselves, and then you pick up this thread of them reframing the situation that they're in. And I'm wondering, when you get to the discussion of the drone pilots, and there's a particular ritual that you find very compelling. And at the conclusion of the book, I think you bring this ritual back as the way, kind of, what is it that's owed to people doing this dirty work? So maybe if you could just talk a little, I'll just sort of jumping ahead in a way to your solutions, but what have you seen that works to reintegrate people who are doing this work? Yeah,
so maybe I'll talk a little bit about the drone section and that ceremony you're referring to. The drone section of the book, you know, might seem like an outlier initially to people who don't think about it and just see the cover, because we think of drones as actually the opposite of dirty. This is sort of technologically precise, precision strikes, a form of warfare that has, I think, been you know, talked about and in some ways marketed as clean. This is the cleanest form of war. But what interested me and struck me is that inside the military, there were these extremely high rates of burnout within the drone program. So in other words, there were people who were enlisting and who after a year or two were leaving, were coming out. And it to the point that the military itself felt this was a problem. How do we man these unmanned aerial vehicles? And they are, by the way, manned. They're hyper manned. They're not unmanned. And so that was a clue that something is going on. And what's going on, the military itself feels from its own assessments and studies, is that far from this kind of antiseptic video game, which I think is some of the ways that people sort of think about drone warfare, to the people who spend the day, who are doing the work of looking at screens and watching targets and making life and death decisions, decisions that might endanger a fellow soldier on the ground, decisions that they come to see endanger innocent civilians. They're making those decisions, but from a distance, without their own boots on the ground, right? And this is, of course, exactly what, as a society, we, in a sense, have decided. I think we decided it kind of by default, but during the Obama presidency, there was a real exhaustion with the kind of messy, dirty ground wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And drones became the kind of solution, in a way, to, you know, Guantanamo, to the black sites, to all of the sort of questions of what do you do when you capture someone and interrogate them. But for the people in the program, it struck me that this wasn't clean at all. And in fact, in that section of the book, I introduce an idea that is really central to the book, called moral injury. And moral injury refers to doing or seeing something in the course of fulfilling your duties that goes against your core values. And it's a term that has really gained currency within the VA and within circles of veterans in the last couple of years, in a sense, to bring moral questions back into the conversation about the trauma of war for the people who fight. Because we've had this conversation about PTSD that is mostly about sort of brain injuries and roadside bombs. But moral injury has nothing to do with that. It has to do with an injury to the soul, to a person's sense of who they are, that you know, various people I interview in the VA and without and outside of the VA feel can be just as traumatizing, just as debilitating to a person's life, to their sense of self. So I kind of unpack that concept in that section. I haven't yet talked about the event you described, but basically one of the things that struck me so much about moral injury is that it is experienced individually and privately. And again, to get to this theme of sort of the good people and the dirty work, you know, if you're not the person in the drone program, if you're not the person in the mental health ward of the prison, it's not you who's undergoing this moral injury. And in fact, you'll likely never to hear about it, because who's going to talk about such an intense personal moral wound, in a sense. So it's very easy to kind of keep it hidden from society and to not have any kind of conversation about it. And yet what's really interesting to me and in a sense exciting is that since the book came out, I've heard from people who are talking about moral injury and trying to communalize it, trying to talk about, you know, trying to have people who experience it come forward and talk about it and sort of broaden the conversation. I'm going to an event in Washington at the National Cathedral in January, where people actually from various professions, including the mental health profession and various others, including journalism actually, are talking about moral injury. And so that's the kind of communalization that I think we need to start doing to get these issues more on the map.
Mm-hmm. And to those, in those events, how do they not fall into mandating that the community endorse the action? So, you know, we have a tradition of honoring soldiers and service members, which of course is very warranted, but it can sometimes slip into a, now you must acquiesce also. How do we manage this problem of, on the one hand, acknowledging the point you're making, which is that people are being asked, they're sort of being sacrificed, if you will, in an expiation for society. Here, you go do this stuff. And you point to a solution of, well, let's try an integration of a communal responsibility. And yet there's still the point of maybe it shouldn't be being done at all, I suppose. So how do you still criticize the dirty worker? Because you're very, in a way, what's remarkable about the book is you're trying to make us very sympathetic and feel responsible, which is very, very warranted. But where's the space for criticism?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I think that, the best way for me to answer it is actually to talk about that ceremony that I didn't talk about when you asked about it. But so I wrote about the drone program, as mentioned, and in that section of the book, I ended up attending a ceremony at the VA in Philadelphia, the Veterans Hospital in Philadelphia, where a group of veterans had gone through weeks of talking to each other and talking about their moral injuries. And then they were going to talk about what they'd done and what they'd seen, but crucially, not with each other, with members of the community. So this event takes place in a chapel, and there's a veteran named Andy, who's a veteran of the Iraq War. And he speaks, he goes forward in front of the audience, and he describes calling in an airstrike where he thought there were enemy in a building, onto a building. And when the smoke cleared, he saw that there were no enemy fighters there. But what there were several dozen civilians. And as Andy is telling this story, he's sobbing in front of this sort of community of people who, like me, did not go to Iraq, did not witness this. The point of the ceremony, and the ceremony, by the way, doesn't end with his words, because after he speaks, the people in the audience are then called forward to circle him and to circle the other veterans who spoke, and in a sense to accept and take responsibility for what they've just talked about having seen and done. And it was an incredibly powerful experience. In terms of judgment, I think that I don't feel, having been there, that anyone who watched Andy speak about what he'd been through would walk away saying, oh, this is fine. This is just okay. It's what happens in war. Maybe if one feels that could be your opinion, but it was impossible not to be confronted with what he himself called, a true reckoning with what the war in Iraq looked like. And crucially, I think it forced everyone who was there to think about their own responsibility, right? Because we have, in a sense, conveniently outsourced the fighting in this country to a volunteer army that consists of 1% of the society. And the other 99% of the society can sit back and forget that the wars are happening, forget that the bloodshed, forget the casualties and the violence of it. It's not everything. It doesn't, in and of itself, a ceremonial like that doesn't land one way or another on the question of whether the war should have been fought or not, but it's at least an honest place. And I think that a lot of what the book is trying to show is that however you feel about the prison system, drone strikes, industrial slaughterhouses, oil production, fossil fuel production, there are certainly people in this audience and in every audience I've spoken to, actually, who probably, will say, well, yeah, but how else do you run a modern society? We do need those things. Someone's got to do Those things are necessary to our lifestyle. Okay, that's a perfectly legitimate point, but we should have a conversation about it. We should be talking about and seeing what it actually entails. And to me, the problem with the drone program is that we don't talk about it. It's completely hidden. And there's a fundamental lack of integrity, I think, collectively to that, to creating this convenient situation where you outsource all of the moral and emotional conflict and burden to a separate class of invisible people, and sit back and forget that it's even happening. And so, you know, that's kind of my intervention in this book. It's not a solution, but it is an intervention.
One of the things that's amazing about the book, and just let me interrupt myself and invite people if they would like to put comments and questions in the chat. I think we've been speaking for about half an hour, and we'll probably go for another 15 to 30 minutes, depending how everyone feels. But anyway, you're invited to chime in. So one of the things that's remarkable about the book is the way in which you reveal worlds that many readers won't know, or they might know one or two, but they want to link them together, the drone context to the slaughterhouse, and to think that there's sort of a common thread running through them. So that's one thing that's very powerful about the book as a piece of journalism and reporting. And yet there's sort of a paradox, because a lot of these contexts are ones where people aren't given information and don't know, and they actually need you to go and find the information. Or, you know, so in a way the book is revelatory, and that's why everyone should read it. And yet at the same time, the reader is slightly berated for endorsing and not giving a damn. So I feel there's a sort of an interesting tension there. And I think the answer is, well, it's a democracy we live in, and we've endorsed this. Which, you know, might be quite debatable in some of these contexts, but maybe, you know, I think let's go, you know, I think we can accept that case by case. But let me just ask you to make the leap for the reader from, so we've talked a little bit about prisons, talked a bit about the drone context and military service and sacrifice. How do you go from there to the industrial slaughterhouse? Like, to many readers, they'll be like, in a way, it's one of the more thrilling parts of the book that you're tying these contexts together, but maybe walk us through that. What is the similarity here? It's so incongruous.
Yeah, so it actually, I deliberately chose the first two examples in the book take place in contexts where public functions are being performed, right? Prisons and jails are public institutions. They have been privatized to a striking degree in this society, but that doesn't, even a privately run prison ultimately is accountable to the governor of the state or the county where it is located. It is under the public's, authority in various ways. And so in that sense, I think it implicates a wider set of people. And I know that, some people are going to think, well, wait a minute, if we don't see these prisons, we don't know what's going on in them, how are any of us involved in this? But I actually think that mass incarceration in the United States reflected the popular will for decades, both among Democrats and Republicans. I think it reflected a kind of collective overreaction to a very real, issue, which was public safety, but at the expense of communities of color and poor people who were being jailed and imprisoned and given sentences that no other Western country has imposed. And so there, I think you see the public connection, or the connection to the rest of society, pretty clearly, because these are public functions. But with slaughterhouses, and actually the second half of the book, there's a different connection. And the connection is a consumer connection, right? The slaughterhouse that I look at is owned by a private company named Sanderson Farms. Has nothing to do with the government. It's a private actor. And it, as I show, treats its workers with just enormous brutality and inhumanity. And so some could say, well, that's because it's a private company. They're the ones responsible. But what's happening in that plant? What's happening is chicken is being mass produced to be sold in fast food restaurants, in supermarkets. Chicken is America's most popular meat. That's why I chose it as a kind of, looking at this. And in that sense, a lot of what's happening, the line speeds, which cause such high rates of injuries to a predominantly immigrant and often undocumented workforce, they're so fast and so many injuries are occurring because the focus is on churning out massive quantities of product at minimal cost, right? And so not surprisingly, you have structural conditions that lead to a lot of exploitation, a lot of repetitive strain injuries, a lot of indignities for the workers. So that's why I chose, I made that shift because I think there will be readers who think, well, okay, you talk about good people. Well, I'm a good person who's not for mass incarceration. I'm a person who's, critical of, secret drone strikes where the public isn't told anything about this. What about eating at a fast food restaurant? What about the industrial food system? What about fossil fuels? Those things are integral to our lifestyles, to the way we run our society. And so I wanted to show that there's sort of dirty work in the shadows there as well. And my goal was not to impugn the public or the reader, but it certainly was to kind of catch people's attention and to create a certain amount of discomfort.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm sort of being provocative, saying that you're, trying to be a little provocative, but
Sure.
I mean, maybe it's sort of this, you're trying to tell us we're being given this gift that we don't even know we're being given in some contexts, and that we should sort of acknowledge it. And if we don't want it, maybe we should try and stop it being given to us. This suffering that's being done on our behalf in part. What was in the slaughterhouse context, could you just explain a little bit more? Is it a moral injury? I mean, it's full of physical mutilation of workers, terrible, urinating on oneself, all kinds of degradation. Is there a moral injury in killing of animals? Is there kind of a common theme in dirty work around killing? Is it taking life? Is this a common thread of your concept of dirty work?
Well, I'll tell you this, the story that really stuck out for me with that is the story that Flor Martinez told me. And Flor is really the main character of the first section set in a chicken slaughterhouse. And she's this remarkable person who is undocumented, gets a job there in the slaughterhouse. And she works there for a while. And like most of the workers I spoke to, initially it's just a job for her. She just needs a paycheck. She doesn't feel in any sense a kind of, this is killing. This is just food. This society needs food. This is part of it. But then one day she sees the actual killing of a chicken at the plant, which is done actually automatic through machines and actually in a separate area, so that the poultry that actually goes through the meatpacking plant has already been killed. It's just being sort of at that point trimmed and taken apart. But at one point she actually sees, because the machines sometimes fail. And when she sees this, she cries. This is what she told me. She said, when I saw that, I cried. And I vowed never to eat chicken again. She eats chicken and she continued working at the plant and she stopped, focusing on that. And in a sense, that story really stayed with me because on one level, it just showed how someone who is not a vegetarian, who is not thinking of this in particularly moral terms, actually finds it really wrenching to see it when she sees it. right? It's really just a shock to her. And yet the other really crucial part of that story is that she does not have the luxury to think too much about that, because she's too concerned about her own problems, including her physical pain, which she starts to develop repetitive strain injury, all kinds of just excruciating pain just from doing these repetitive tasks on these lines that go so fast. And you mentioned another aspect of what went on in that plant, but the workers, particularly the women who worked there, were not allowed to take bathroom breaks, and that literally resulted in some of them going to work with an extra pair of pants and going to the bathroom on the line while they were working, and then changing. But it was such a shocking thing to hear. And when I first heard it, I thought, well, wait a minute, is this really true? And then someone sent me a report that Oxfam had done about the poultry industry as a whole, and it wasn't actually unique to that plant, this problem. And so, again, it's striking how distant, given how central the industrial food system is to the way Americans eat, to the consumption habits and so forth. It's very hidden. In fact, it was harder to get into a slaughterhouse than it was to get onto a drone base or into a prison. Mm-hmm. That was actually the hardest thing to actually see as a reporter, because it's so walled off and it's so protected.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful detail. The chicken security state. I don't think anyone's the national security state we know about. Katie Wozniak asked a question. Let me read it to the group. In the first part of your book, you mentioned the prison system in Norway or Sweden being so much more humane. Do any of these types of prisons exist in the US? And if I might just be selfish and add on, does this mean that dirty work might not be so necessary? Is it something specific to American late capitalism and privatization? Is it endemic to modern society, or could it all be humanized a la Norway?
So I do, and thank you for the question. I tried throughout the book to draw some comparisons. And that was one of them. There's another one actually in the slaughterhouse section. I talk about how during the COVID pandemic, where the workers in these plants were getting sick and dying in very disproportionate numbers because of the close quarters they work in, because of the lack of masks and protective equipment they were often lacking. And in this country, the response from the Trump administration was to invoke the National Defense Act and order the workers to go back to work with no guarantees that they would be socially distanced, with no guarantees that they would be given protective equipment. In Germany, there was an outbreak, and the outbreak at the slaughterhouse actually forced the schools in this part of Germany to shut down because it started spreading throughout the community. And the response there from the labor minister in Germany was to describe the slaughterhouse, which initially blamed the workers and said, they live in close quarters, they don't practice social distance, and that's the problem. The labor minister said, well, that's unacceptable, and this industry is a system of organized irresponsibility. That's what he called it, and demanded reforms that were subsequently passed. So I drew those comparisons in those places to try to make it clear that this is not a done deal, right? That although I do think there is dirty work in every society, I don't think how it is organized and how harmful it is etched in stone. I think that is, it can change. It can change because laws are passed. It can change because unions organize. It can change because public consciousness shifts. And it can also lead, and I hope it does lead, to having society think about, do we need this at all, right? Because that I think is the question, Mateo, that you were asking about war. Do we need to be fighting these wars at all? that I think is sort of hovering over some of the different cases. You know, and I do think that there are forms of dirty work that we as a society should say shouldn't happen at all. They're just, you know, we don't need to do this, and we could do things differently. And I would say that the warehousing, you know, using jails and prisons to warehouse people who are mentally ill, that shouldn't happen. And I think that there was, you know, a real consensus around that, you know, 40 years ago when the asylums were being shut down. But I think we've kind of lost that, and we've kind of, you know, because of the secrecy and the concealment.
Mm-hmm. There's another question. Were people resistant to open up to you and share these stories? And if, again, I might be selfish, one of the amazing things about the book is really, as a reader, you feel like you're brought into conversation with all these other people in the country that you didn't know about. In a sense, the book is advocating for a new kind of communication to understand where people are coming from. And in particular, you've got a bit of a, you know, another critique of the well-meaning liberal type who doesn't want to know and is superior. I think that runs through a lot of the stories, actually, that the people who are doing the dirty work and feeling badly done by are feeling also very judged. And one thing the book is doing, if you're a liberal reader, is to help you see people more in the round. So anyway, just to repeat the question, were people resistant? What was your role as an interlocutor, and were people resistant to open up and share the stories?
The answer is yes. I think there was a lot of, I don't think there's a story in the book that didn't take a lot of time and effort and trust to start the process of talking about this. And just to refer to I'll just say about Chris Aarons. Chris Aarons is the first drone operator in the book. And I first met him at a conference he spoke at. And I came up to him afterwards and introduced myself, and we sat and talked for a while. And he said, "This is interesting and I'll think about it." But it was very clear that he did not want to talk about what he'd gone through personally, and he was unable to. And actually the next time I met him, I'd gotten back in touch with him, and he sort of agreed to talk a little bit. When he started talking about what he'd gone through, his back seized up. He actually had like a physical reaction to talking about it. And then he didn't want to talk anymore. So we cut the conversation off. And that conversation unfolded over the course of several years, actually. In other cases, in the slaughterhouse section of the book, people didn't want to talk because they were afraid. They were afraid that if they exposed, even if they spoke under pseudonyms, the government would come and check their papers, would kick them out, they would be fired, they would be reprimanded. There was just an enormous amount of fear in that context. But you know, that made it really, I felt the importance of these conversations because it's all there. It's just, you know, there's a book I referred to very early in the book called The Hidden Injuries of Class by Richard Sennett and another, Peter Cobb. And this book, you know, that phrase, hidden injuries, is really what I was encountering. And you know, because they're hidden and there's shame involved or there's just personal anguish, people don't want to talk about it. But if they don't talk about it, then we never know that it's there. And so I'm hoping that that the book kind of does bring you into conversation with these people. And just to say the last thing I'll say about you mentioned the good liberal or the person who is maybe, you know, implicated in some of these stories. And what I'd really like readers to think of when they read about the people doing this work is to think of them as agents of society. You know, that whatever you make of what they're doing is playing this role and this function that has been that is a function of these large forces, the consumption habits of Americans, the cars we drive, the way we have organized our mental health system. These are sort of, in that sense, people who are connected to us, and judging them is very easy, but I think we have to think about who ends up in these roles and who does not.
Mm-hmm. Do you have thoughts particular to this community, to Buffalo, what dirty work looks like here, things that a community like the one we're speaking to now, conversations they might think about trying to instigate, how might people inspired by your book, what might they do?
I haven't thought of it in terms of, Buffalo as a specific place, but, I think my hope is that, I think there's a form of politics that sometimes arises around things like, the consumption of food. And it's a very individualized form of politics in which people search very hard for labels on the food so that they don't feel what they're buying has caused, harm to animals or to the environment or whatever else. And I think that's a very important impulse. I'm not naysaying it, but I think that my own conclusion from writing the book was that there's a limit to how far that goes, and that the conversations we need to start having are about the collective choices we make, the people we elect to office, the decisions we make about where resources are invested and where they're not invested, because those things really shape in a much more structural way. The fact that even if you yourself don't buy the poultry that is, involves inhumane treatment of animals, someone else will. And most likely it's going to be someone who can't afford to buy the, as I say this, and at one point in that section of the book, it's just a fact that in Buffalo, as I think throughout the country, if you want to buy, organic, humanely raised, farm raised, all of that, you pay more. And so, this kind of moral divide between the workers who do this kind of work and people who never see it, and the consumers who want to have nothing to do with it, in a way it's reproduced, right? And I think we have to sort of think beyond just the individual ways that we can not feel implicated in this, and think about the collective ways we can try to change it.
Great. Well, I think we're pretty much getting to the end of our time. Is there any more comments? Or the questions have been great in the chat. I got one message, which was a link to OSHA reg, providing that bathrooms must be supplied. I take the point of your point is there's not much enforcement there. So
no, I'm very glad that came up, because of course that's what the companies will say. What do you mean we don't allow workers to have bathroom breaks? That's an OSHA regulation, and we would be fine. We would be shut down. Well, I have news for everyone. They don't get shut down. They do occasionally get inspected by OSHA, but OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is part of the Department of Labor. Its budget is very small. And when it inspects facilities, it often gives the companies a heads up. So the companies know. And lo and behold, a lot of the things that the workers felt were going on, it's the same thing actually that I feared seeing if I went into a plant as a reporter, which is you get this sanitized picture, right? You get everything is sort of cleaned up and there's nothing wrong going on here. And then when you leave, they go back to business as usual. And so, but that's a great example of, it's true, the OSHA regulation. But there's a question of enforcement. And there's a question of, the vulnerability of the workers who feel too afraid to talk to me. Think of how afraid they are to tell their supervisors, hey, we want to be treated differently. This is not okay. So, you know, again, we have to think about those collective decisions.
Great. Well, Eyal, thank you so much. Really interesting conversation, and it's great to be here with this group of people. So let me sign off and hand things back to Katie. I think she had some parting messages, if I'm not mistaken. And anyway, thank you so much for the great book.
And thank you, Mateo, for being such a great interlocutor tonight. And I do see a few familiar names. I don't see your faces. I just see little black boxes. But I just want to say that it's really special for me to talk to an audience from Buffalo. You know, my parents and my sister live there. I come and visit, and it just makes this especially meaningful to me. So thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you for joining us tonight. I have to say that hour flew by, and I honestly feel like I could sit here for another hour and still be completely interested in, you know, just absorbing everything that you're saying. So for those of you who haven't read the book, I think that this surely will make you want to go out and purchase it. I mean, it's compelling and written beautifully for, you know, the topics that it's covering. And I just want to thank you for continuing your work and dedication on reporting on these difficult topics and things that aren't easy to write about, and, you know, having these conversations. It's such important work. So, and if I can put you on the spot before we close one more time, Eyal. So from being from Buffalo, I just wanted to say and ask, when you come back to visit, where are your must-to places to go or food that you have to eat?
Yes. Well, I have to say that the last time I was in Buffalo, I did not have wings, and we've just talked about chicken. And so, you know, this is an issue that I actually stopped eating chicken while I was writing the book, but I do eat chicken now. And so I'm as guilty as all of the people who will feel implicated and impugned, you know, and I try to do the thing of looking at the labels, so the place I absolutely must eat, I must tell you, is the kitchen of my parents' home, because my mother is a wonderful chef, and it's hard to get better food than what she serves. That's the food I miss the most. But I do miss the haunts and the places that, you know, and New York pizza is healthier, but there's a place in my heart for Buffalo pizza that we don't get here.
Well, thank you. I think you just scored some bonus points with your mom. Well, thank you guys again. And, you know, we wish you much success, and I'm sure that there will be another book in your future, and we'll continue following your career. So thank you both again.
Thank
you. Stay well. Have a wonderful night, everybody. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.